So today we're going to be talking about a solution we've been building out for about 2 years now. We call it an intelligence-led approach to validation and remediation. And it's focused on proactive. So remediation in this sense is not after an incident has occurred, but in order to prevent an incident actually occurring. Before we dive into it though, just a little bit about ourselves. So we work in Mandiant Consulting, which you may know it was acquired by Google Cloud a little over a year ago. I've been with Mandiant for about 6 years now, a little over, I guess 7 now. 6 years was in Intel, and I'm going on 2 years in the consulting side. So we're both on a consulting team for global cyber defense. And what we focus on is twofold. First is operational support, where we provide analysts to security operations centers. We do detection engineering support, hands-on support there, infrastructure, architecture support. And we also do transformation efforts, which is a second piece and what this approach falls into. And what we mean by transformation is when we show up at a client, there has usually been a large compromise. It's usually very publicly in the news, and they don't want it to happen again. So how do we fix or transform their cyber defense program to prevent another compromise from occurring, right? Move the needle so that they're more proactively prepared to deal with the threats that are going to target them. A little bit about my background. I work remotely from Buffalo. Background is in cyber threat intelligence. Been doing that for about 15 years. Did not intend ever to become a cyber person. I started out working criminal intelligence and then just accidentally fell into cyber, and I've been here over 10 years now. Pass it to Omar.
Yeah. Hey everyone, Omar Tor here. I'm based out of Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. I've been with the organization. Next week will be 3 years. When I started, I had long hair. This is what cybersecurity does to you. I've been in this for a while. By the way, this is the second part. This is a duplicate session, so if you were in the previous one, some of the jokes might be repeated. But yeah, my background's mainly in security operations, incident response, digital forensics. I've worked in the SOC. I was in the military. And now, we help our clients with operational support, so anything from like SOC management to analyst work to large-scale transformations. And just before we begin, I want to thank Cyber Florida for having us. Buffalo, Pennsylvania. It was 30 degrees on Saturday. It is not 30 degrees out here, so really excited to be here. All right, so the agenda for today, we're going to cover the Defender's Advantage, a focus on intelligence validation remediation, the methodology that we came up with, really what Emily came up with, and then a ransomware case study to kind of walk you through what that methodology looks like, and then we'll have some time for Q&A. During the sessions, if you do have questions, definitely feel free to raise your hand. We want to make this a discussion type, and there's plenty of time, as we discovered yesterday. Cool. So the Defender's Advantage, I have the book in my backpack. So we think it's important to give a high-level overview of the Defender's Advantage. It was a concept that was developed by Mandiant and published into a book back in 2022. The Defender's Advantage is the concept that organizations are defending against attacks in their own environment. So theoretically, the battle space is your environment, and you should have an advantage because you're dictating what the attackers can and can't do to your environment, right? And then anything on here like the graphics and all of that stuff, the book. It's in the book. It's available by PDF for free online. You can do a quick search. I think we have links to it in our bio. But yeah, there's some webinars out there as well. So it's really just going to be a high-level overview of the Defender's Advantage. All right. So in an ideal world, a security program consists of 4 domains: security governance, security architecture, security risk management, and cyber defense. We're, of course, going to be focusing on cyber defense in our talk today. But ideally, you would want your cybersecurity strategy to be guided by those relevant threats. So threat intelligence should be guiding that strategy rather than just the shotgun approach, which is what majority of companies end up going towards rather than looking at their threat intelligence. And once again, this is a cyclical thing, right? Not just let's look at some threat intelligence from 2019 and base the 10 years worth of strategy on that, right? That's not going to work. You kind of have to revisit that over and over again. And of course, you would want optimized threat detection and response, defendable architecture, and the piece that we're going to be talking about here today is continuous validation. Once again, you want that to be cyclical. You want to continue revisiting your threat actors. You want to continue taking in threat intelligence and validating that your controls are working, that your processes are working. And then last but not least, and very important, is that in an ideal state, you want your company culture to have cybersecurity built around it. Your people should be, they should be thinking of the impact that they have, because they're touching machines that have, that can cause a lot of damage, and you want them to be security minded from the get-go. So let's jump into the cyber defense domain. It's of course made up of 6 different functions: intel, hunt, respond, validate, and command and control. And if you look at this graphic here, not a huge fan of it, but we get the point that they're trying to make here, is that at the center you have command and control, and if you work in security operations, that's C2 is not a good thing. So we're trying to get them to change the name of that, but that's your overarching, that's your leadership, your guidance, and around the circle here you have intel, which really should be your lifeblood, feeding into each one of those functions. And then if you look at the outside, that validate has an arrow around it, once again continuously validating that all of those pieces are working together in a good fashion. And the goal of your cyber defense program is really to actively resist attacks and minimize the impact to an organization, so that you can, the organization can continue to operate regardless of the threats that are out there. Once again, we have the 6 functions here. We're going to be doing a deep dive into intel and validate, so not really going to cover those here on this slide. But just a high-level overview, Hunt provides you proactive capabilities. Keyword there being proactive. As Emily mentioned before, a lot of people do threat hunting, or what they consider threat hunting, after an incident has occurred, after they get some events. But you really want to be proactive about this, using intelligence to look through your environment, developing hunt missions that can eventually turn into detections for your organization. And then, once again, focusing on taking those detections and then building response processes around those detections. And last but not least, that command and control, manages cyber defense functions, making sure that they're operating in an effective manner, that the inputs are going, their outputs are going to the right functions, and vice versa.
Okay. So a little bit of a deep dive into the specific functions that we're trying to basically pull together into a comprehensive program. So the first is intel, and when we talk about intel at Mandiant, we talk about it as the guiding light for all of the other functions. So definition of intel at its core is evaluated information that is relevant, timely, and actionable for a decision maker. That's the core piece. If it's not all of those 3 things, it's not intel, right? It might be information, it might be data, but it's not intel, okay? What we want to do with intel, though, is we want to have it help us mitigate risk, understand what our threats are so that we can address them proactively, provide decision advantage. It should help decision makers at all levels of an organization make decisions that will better protect it proactively too. And we can start prioritizing resources around those decisions, ensuring the value of the operations, and we'll show how that works with this approach as well. A couple different definitions in intel, though, that I might refer to throughout the presentation is there's really 3 different levels of intelligence, and they all build upon each other. So kind of think of it like a house of cards. If you start at the bottom, which I know this graphic isn't in that shape, it's the tactical, right? This is the artifacts that you're pulling out of an IR investigation. It's the indicators of compromise, or IOCs, all of those tangible things, but because intel needs to be actionable, it's not just an IP, it's not just a URL, it's not just a hash. It's a context around all of those. What makes them bad? When were they bad? How long should they be bad? So that's your tactical piece, right? On top of tactical, we build operational. That's more of the behaviors of how a threat actor operates, the tactic, techniques, and procedures. How did the threat actor leverage this URL? Was it compromised? Was it stood up on their own infrastructure? All of that starts to build into how a threat actor operates. And tactical might be used in like your threat intelligence platform. You might be feeding it in for detections at an IOC level and then coming back to your SOC, where operational may be used more by your response teams, your threat hunters, your IR team, right, to understand how the threat actor is moving through an environment. And then at the top of that, at the very top of the level of house of cards, is your strategic. And that is based on your tactical operational. And basically, that is trends, patterns, understanding why a threat actor operates the way that they do. So for example, my background used to be tracking Chinese espionage actors. I would want to understand, what are they going after? All of these individuals show up to work, like we do every day, to target a specific list of entities that their boss told them to target, right? They have intelligence requirements, just like defenders have intelligence requirements. So if I can understand that, I can understand what they're going to go after. That's that high level piece, right? It might also be something like a cyber threat profile, a high level understanding about the threats to your organization that you could brief up to an executive. Key piece here though, the takeaway is house of cards. If your tactical level is bad, you can't build good intelligence and good assessments on top of that. And then just a brief note on something that I found incredibly useful in the last few years since it came out is the MITRE ATT&CK framework. So what this has allowed me to do when talking to clients is I can take a MITRE ATT&CK framework and I can talk to a SOC lead, I can talk to an incident response lead, and I can talk to a CISO. And it gives me a common taxonomy to use to talk to all of them about what they care about, right? So for example, I can deep dive into a technique with a SOC analyst and help them understand what they should be looking for when they're doing an alert review. Or I can show the whole framework to a CISO and say, this is where you have coverage, or this is where you're most likely to be targeted. What resources do you want to focus on to fix this? So really useful, and I'll show you how we use it as part of the solution as well. But with that, I'll pass it back to Omar.
Yeah, so looking at validation, I'm not going to read the text in the blue, but the one thing I do want to highlight is relevant threats being underscored, right? Oftentimes we come into, we see validation teams try to boil the ocean. They're throwing all sorts of stuff at their blue teams, and there's no real purpose behind it. If you look back, to our keynote yesterday, our chief bank robber, Jason, he talked about that, your red team's job is not to catch the blue team with their pants down. It's to help the organization get better. It's to help identify those gaps, pass it on to them, make sure you're talking to each other and to remediate those gaps because you're essentially trying to, better your organization's security, right? So that part is very important. That's why we use intelligence, because we want to focus on relevant threats, and we want to try to get the low-hanging fruit and have a targeted way of remediating rather than just trying to throw whatever we're comfortable with. For example, a red teamer might be comfortable with a certain tool, and that's all they use in their assessments. That's not that's not effective to anyone. And then some examples of validation. Of course, we know the targeted attack testing, the red team, purple team type stuff. But a lot of things that people forget about is that in the respond functions and in some of the other functions, there's processes out there, right? What are you doing to validate those processes are actually working, such as using operational tabletops or threat space type simulations where you're actually presenting your SOC with scenarios, or even your management with scenarios that they have to actually think about, rather than stuff that they theory crafted in a Word document somewhere that never works, right? So you of course want to continuously validate not just the processes, not just your tools, but the processes as well. All right, and of course all of that's to evaluate the effectiveness of your security program, because if it's not working, then why are you continuing to do it, right? All right, and then remediation across the function. So in an ideal world, this is what it would look like. Intel would feed the validate function. The validate would feed detection and respond, hunt, and command and control. And each of those would have outputs that eventually all go back and go through. And we'll have examples of this here shortly.
All right.
Yeah.
So we're going to go through the methodology that we developed in kind of two phases. The first phase is going to be a high-level overview, so very conceptual. In the second phase, we're going to apply that methodology to ransomware threats. If there's questions at any time, though, please just stop me and ask, because I want this to be interactive and hopefully take a few analytic tips back with you. But before we dive really into the analysis part, because I can go ad nauseum on analysis, I want to really highlight why this approach is important and why our team felt we really needed to develop it. So we've been going into clients for years and years, right? And as an Intel analyst, I would provide them with a threat profile. I would tell them, hey, this threat actor, you need to focus on that. But it would end up being a nice story. It wouldn't actually drive any cyber defense activities. So that's really the importance of the intelligence-led approach and why we're doing it. It also helps to focus resources on what matters to the organization, because every cyber defense organization has a small budget and very few employees who are usually very overtasked. So we really want to focus on what matters for that Intel-led piece. The second part, as Omar mentioned a little bit ago, is that shotgun approach to validation actions. So when we're looking at pen tests or red team assessments or purple team assessments, or even leveraging a validation tool, a lot of organizations just say, tell us what's best. And a lot of vendors would be like, well, this is kind of our one-size-fits-all validation exercise, right? Let's just test all these things. You might not have the technology or environment relevant to those actions, or those threat actors might not matter to you. So why are you testing them? So that's why we want to do a customized approach to an organization to really make sure that we're looking at the threats that matter and also applying that to the technology that actually exists within the environment for that organization. And then we also started finding every time we would go into a client, some clients would have like a purple team assessment conducted maybe every 6 months, and we would do that for like 3 years, and nothing would ever get fixed. It would be the same findings over and over. So we weren't actually moving the needle, which for us as transformation being part of our mission, we really wanted to see that needle move, right? We wanted to come in and say, okay, from the last 6 months, you fixed these things, now let's test something new. But we were testing the same things over and over. So we wanted to find a way where we can take those findings and actually operationalize them for improvement within the client's environment. And then the last thing that we see, and this goes back to that company culture piece that Omar talked about, is the different teams in cyber defense orgs don't talk to each other, right? Intel doesn't always talk to the SOC doesn't always talk to IR, and if it does, it's at the management level. It doesn't filter down. So when I accidentally fell into cyber about 10 years ago, I was actually an Intel analyst, and I sat on the Security Operations Center floor. I had a SOC analyst right next to me, and that's essentially how I learned all the technology part, right? I had no idea what Base 64 was, but they taught me. But having those interactions and kind of cross-training each other and not operating in silos, that's what's going to strengthen the overall cyber defense org. And this multi-function approach is really what this solution focuses on.
A question for you. So we provide these beautiful reports to our clients, all very nicely laid out, 20 pages, and they come in a secure email. I'd say almost half of them don't even open their secure email.
Yep.
And the other half, I'm not sure they're even reading any of it. Even the red, because I have it like green, yellow, red. So I'm thinking about just taking the most important ones and just say, hey, we need to do this.
Yep.
Username Jill, password Jill, that's not good.
Yep. Yeah, and also like tactical recommendations. Like you need to go in there, like we've done reports where it's like screenshot, click this button, next screenshot, click this button. And when that doesn't work, what we've been doing is scoping in time for us to actually get hands-on keyboard with the client to fix those things for them. And that seems to have the most positive impact. Yeah.
Yeah, oftentimes we'll find that with a pen test, like a red team report or something, it's great, 40 pages of awesome technical information, but there's no remediation plan. And it's like, hey, we found 40 findings, go fix them. Where do you start? What are you prioritizing? You know, so that's the whole Intel-led approach is like, hey, we're able to take those findings and prioritize them and make a remediation plan, like a roadmap, to address certain things. And that way you can actually take bite-sized pieces instead of, all right, now you've given somebody a 40-page document, they have 40 things to fix. Chances are they're not going to look at it, or they're going to try to fix one or two things or get overwhelmed really quickly. And we're finding every 6 months, like organizations are doing the cyclical thing for red teaming. For example, they'll pen test now, they'll pen test 6 months from now, a year from now, same findings over and over again because somebody didn't have the time to go through them. So taking that stuff and like really breaking it down so it's consumable is super important.
Yeah, and we'll actually start scoping in like, okay, you have a pen test, it's going to be in Q1. How about at the end of Q1, early Q2, you have some remediation help from us. Let's focus on building detections or something like that.
Yeah. Go ahead. I was just going to offer that what's worked for us, you don't have a lot of people, there's not a lot of resources, right? So when we get stuff over to our remediation team, it's important that, so we do it every 2 weeks, we send them a report. We say, hey, here's your priorities to get after. Then the next time we send a report, we tell them to delete the old report and go after the stuff on the report. So that they're not just looking at this mountain of things to accomplish. So you're at least fixing the most important stuff as they come up, and not just stacking reports on reports.
Yeah, it's like, how do you eat an elephant, right? Like one bite at a time. And that's kind of what we've tried to do here. When you do that though, and you send like the new report, are you watching that they closed out the stuff from the previous one?
So in our environment, not exactly. So yes, we are watching that. However, we're not trying to control it so much because we realize that it's just not manageable in our organization because we don't have enough people to even do that part.
Right.
So at least they've got something that they can get after, and they've been getting after it way better than they were before because they're able to digest that thing that we send them.
Yeah, you got to crawl, walk, run, right? If you can get them to that point now, a year from now, you might be going a lot faster.
Exactly.
And yeah, that's awesome. So really high level on this one. The next slide is what I'm going to really focus on, but we basically have a 4-phase approach. Intel is always first, followed by the validation pieces in green, And then we have this like assess phase, which would kind of align to the command and control piece, I think, where we take the findings and basically bucket them. And by bucketing them, it helps prioritize and also guide to which team that they go in. This will make sense, I promise, in a few more slides. And then phase 4 is the actual remediation, depending on which functions it's aligned to. We're going to focus a lot on detection today for that because it's the easiest to kind of illustrate, but it would go to whichever hunt or respond function, and Omar will talk about that. But this slide really kind of iterates that linear phase and how it would actually operate. So it is incremental, and it is also iterative. So I'll kind of timeline it out for you of how we've been delivering this. So the blue phase is that intel-led approach. There's 2 deliverables that come out of that, and I'll show you how we built those. First is the threat identification. What are the threat actors that matter to you? Once I have that list, I pull the MITRE attack mappings, and I align those to the validation actions that I'm going to either recommend that the validation tool runs or a purple team executes. From there, they execute those validation findings in the green. The blue part happens every 6 months to a year, is kind of how I set it up. And that's because the threat changes. There should also be a process to pull in kind of at an ad hoc threat actors that just all of a sudden emerge and are very pertinent to your industry. But this is kind of a static 6 to 12 month threat landscape snapshot. The green phase, the actual validation piece, depends on the workload that your validation team can handle. So the review and contextualize findings is actually the most work in this whole cycle, maybe second only to remediation, because you actually have to go in and look at how that validation action ran in the environment and determine how, did it run correctly? Did it run as we expected? Is this an accurate finding from it? So we'll actually have what we call a spreadsheet of truth, and that'll also make more sense in a few slides, where we take from the validation tool of the purple team, the findings, and then our consultant will go in, review and contextualize, and we have a second set of findings, and we want to see what the difference is. And that's because we want to understand maybe the purple team didn't understand the environment or the tool wasn't correctly configured in the environment to actually give us the accurate results. So for example, sometimes if we use a validation tool to run it, it might not be correctly connected to the EDR, and we might not be getting the fact that it actually alerted or something like that. So that's why we do it manually there as well until we feel confident enough that the tool is running and giving us accurate results. The detection capability assessment piece is where we actually analyze and build that roadmap from the validation results. Where are your gaps, where are your capabilities, and what do we need to fix, and who do they need to go to? A lot of that we've been able to automate, and I'll explain why automation is so important as well. And that feeds into the remediation roadmap and then the remediation work streams, and we iterate through this pretty much monthly to quarterly depending on the speed of the client that we're working with. When we look at this though, and I don't know who was at the keynote yesterday when the OODA loop was brought up, but this is essentially an OODA loop. And I want to kind of dig into OODA loop a little bit because it's very pertinent not only for the military side, but also for Intel. So when we look at OODA loop, observe, orient, decide, and act, right? We want to move around that as an analyst or an Intel person or decision maker to make accurate decisions, right? The faster we go around it, the more we can proactively react to something. Think of your threat actor, right? Intel side. Threat actors doing the same thing. They need to observe, orient, decide, and act in order to compromise something or target something. Whichever of the defender or the threat actor is going to operate faster around that OODA loop is going to win, right? So if we add automation into this, it introduces efficiency, and we can go around this circle faster and faster, hopefully outpacing our adversary in the meantime. So just kind of a way to kind of correlate those two things together if you were able to be at the keynote yesterday. Any questions on this overall? We're going to dig deeper into each of these phases in the next few slides. Okay. So Intel, my favorite part. So the way that I kind of do this is in 3 steps. The first is identify the threat actors that matter to you. So essentially what I'll do is I'll filter it on a few things. The first is the industry that the organization operates in, and it might be multiple industries. So I do it industry focused. What threat actors have targeted X, Y, Z industry. And then I filter that again by geography. What actors have targeted XYZ industry in ABC geography or wherever that organization has business operations. So it might just be in the United States, it might be the United States and Switzerland, it might be United States, Switzerland, and China. I want to focus on those areas. From there, I filter that down to the threat actors that have just been active in the last 2 years. That's kind of how I time bound that. But when I look at threat actors in the last 2 years, I want to understand in step 2 how they operate. But a threat actor is a human, so this is where some psychology and intel also comes in. Think of all of the MITRE ATT&CK tactics, all the malware families that they've used. That's their toolbox, right? So we don't want to time-bound what we collect for their behavioral piece. Because just because a threat actor has maybe been around for 10 years and they're operating one way today, they could say, well, this was effective 8 years ago. Why don't I just dust this off and use it again? So I pull all the MITRE attacks for that threat actor since we've observed them. And I basically dump them into a big Excel spreadsheet. And then I do a frequency analysis to help me understand what of those techniques are higher priority or used by more of the threat actors that matter. And I align those to the environment that I want to test and the validation actions I want to test in that environment. Okay? We go, we test, we do the green phase. Okay, we get our results back. For our purple team and also our validation tool, our results come into these 3 categories. Was it logged, meaning do we have telemetry for that action? Was it alerted on, meaning was an alert or a ticket escalated to a SOC analyst for review or investigation, or was it blocked? And we basically have made assessments based on these findings to bucket them. So we might have a gap in logging and visibility. That means all of those findings were false. No telemetry, no alert, no blocking. We had no evidence that action or that malicious activity ever even occurred in this environment. We have a gap in alerting. We have telemetry, nothing was escalated to the SOC. So we can see it, but we're not alerting on it. So that might be like you need a detection created, right? Opportunity for improvement is kind of a gray area. So that might be where we logged and alerted on it, but we didn't block. And we might want to decide, do we want to block? Can we block it? Do we have the technology there to block it? And if we don't, we have another blue phase that'll come in the next case study, but it's basically what we call an optimized capability. So we might say, well, we logged it and we alerted on it. We don't want to block it because it would be a bad business decision for how people operate in our environment. So we'll call that an optimized capability. We got it as far as we can in that environment to fulfill what we need for our risk mitigation. And then the detection capability, or the green, is basically true across the board. It's logged, alerted, blocked. We're good, should be covered for that specific action. At this point, though, we basically have a big spreadsheet that connects the threat actor to the specific technique, to the specific instantiation of that action that was run. So when you look at a MITRE ATT&CK technique, it's a big bucket of a bunch of ways a threat actor could operate, right? There's an infinite number of ways you could leverage a technique. So you're never going to have full coverage for it. So that's why you need to kind of keep linking together threat actor, technique. That technique's going to have a priority. It's going to have an action connected to it. And then that action is going to have an assessment connected to it. So all that data is linked together so that you can also make decisions off of that as well. And then this is where the automation starts coming in, is we actually automate a lot of the findings after we do that manual review. The findings go into a spreadsheet. The spreadsheet starts going into dashboards. And I'll just show you some of the reporting that we do. So we call this a detection capability assessment phase, essentially. And this is just a snapshot in time of, based on month 1 actions that we ran, you've got some capabilities, you've got some opportunities for improvement, and you have some gaps, right? So this one looks pretty good. A lot of the times with clients, there's a lot more red. But the idea is this is a snapshot, right? It's a starting point. We want to track improvement over time. So when we start doing the remediation phase, we'll update this. We'll flip something from maybe a gap in logging to we onboarded the telemetry in month 2, it's now a gap in alerting. And it'll eventually go through the cycle where green increases, we might have some blue coming in, but essentially we're trying to lower the yellow and the red, right? We're trying to move the needle on the detection capabilities or the overall cyber defense posture of that organization. We can also map it across different environments because different environments in an organization might have different expectations of who's using them and how the defenses should operate or the control should operate in that environment. This also helps different leaders within an organization identify where they want to focus resources for remediation. So environment 1 might be a higher priority than environment number 4. So we want to focus on remediation there. So different ways to eat the elephant, basically, is what we're trying to provide to the client so that they can make more informed decisions. Not only intelligence informed, but also specific to the threats within their environment and the gaps that they have. We can also map this all across the MITRE ATT&CK tactics. So each of the techniques are aligned to a tactic, And I've had clients say, well, initial access we're going to kind of ignore because our validation efforts are focused on once the threat actor gets in, right? If we're doing external like attack surface management, that would be a different cycle. But they might say, let's focus on execution. I want to turn execution all green and all blue. Because if I ideally can get as far left of the attack's life cycle as I can, I shouldn't even have a threat actor getting to discovery. So we'll get to the point where we get the execution piece covered, and then we'll move to persistence and just kind of iterate through it that way.
All right, so as we mentioned, that we're going to kind of focus on detection engineering on this one, but we kind of wanted to show you what remediation looks like across the functions. So, for example, you do get some intel that you have a threat actor that's of interest to you. What do you do with that information, right? As mentioned before, your hunt team would want to build now you have a gap in a hunt mission because you're not looking for that threat actor, right? So in order to remediate that, you would just build a proactive hunt mission. I know it looks super simple on this slide, and you're going to find out here shortly that it's not super simple, right? And eventually you want to take that proactive hunt, turn that into a detection. Especially if you have a gap in visibility or alerting, you eventually want to turn that into a detection capability or an optimized detection. And of course, in respond, you'd want a correlating respond playbook with that detection, right? Or even if there isn't a detection there, you see some sort of attacker TTPs, you want to build some sort of response around that. And yesterday, somebody asked a great question on how do you deal with alert fatigue, and your detection team's building all these detections, they're sending them to your SOC, and your SOC's just getting overwhelmed. And my question back was, are your two teams talking to each other? Because oftentimes, especially in large organizations, this is not just one person wearing this hat, it's multiple teams and they have a job to do. So detection engineers are going out, cranking out detections as fast as they possibly can without talking to the SOC. And how are you going to build something that is going to alert, that needs a human's response without talking to them about it, without giving them any context on it, right? So that context piece is very important, and why we recommend, if you're building a detection, let's say you build 5 detections, you should have a weekly, bi-weekly, monthly, whatever it is, call with your SOC to go through those. Hey, this is what we are looking for in this detection, and this is how you would respond to it. And I promise you, the SOC's going to say, actually, yeah, we've been seeing these alerts before, or this is how I would respond to it, and that helps not only fine-tune the detection, but the response process as well, and that should be, once again, all around in a cycle, right? All right, and so focusing back on just the detect, right? We talked about gap in visibility. We want to build a detection capability. What does that look like in a flow chart? So up here we have the gap in logging and visibility. Let's say, and by the way, the reds are completely okay as well. If you, for some reason, if it's not viable, you don't have a technology, or it's going to cost you $100,000 to get this piece of equipment just to build one detection and alert on it, probably not the best use of your time, right? That's something that leadership needs to make a decision on based on the information that they have. But if you do have that log source, you can ingest it, and now you have a gap in alerting. You have the visibility there, but you don't have alerts built around that log. Once again, if it's not viable for alerting, doesn't make sense, you have the logs coming in, they're there for historical reference rather than an alert, not a problem. You can just go ahead and say it's not viable for an alert, but that still, once again, moves that needle, right? You're addressing an issue. If you do, for some reason, want to build a detection for it, you can deploy the new detection signature, and now you have a gap in blocking. You're not always going to want to block stuff. Think about PowerShell, right? PowerShell in your environment, I bet system administrators are using it. If you block PowerShell across your entire environment because of threat actors, there's a chance your business is not going to work, right? So you might want to alert on it, but not necessarily block that activity, which is completely okay as well. And if you do that, that's where we talked about that being an optimized capability rather than a detection capability. But if you do block, that's cool too. Now you have a full detection capability with blocking there as well. All right. Here we go. That's already started.
Yeah. Before we dive into the ransomware stuff, are there any questions on the overall methodology? Okay. So we're going to apply this whole cycle to ransomware specifically. So every single phase we're going to go through, we're going to look at some fake data, but it'll illustrate a little bit more, I think, of how we do this. So intel-led approach. Identify the threat actors that matter to you. We're focused specifically on ransomware in this case, which is a little bit different than what I described before. But same concept, right? Threat category, ransomware. I might want to get more granular if I have a specific client. I might want to say, maybe I just want to look at ransomware that's impacted telecom in the last 2 years, or maybe just in the past 6 months. Just make sure that you are scoping it to whatever matters to your organization, because that's the relevant threats. And then also document how you're scoping it as well, because you're bound to get questions. Learned that one a few times. So what I ended up pulling for this case example is basically these are all the malware families and the threat actors that Mandiant has seen in the last quarter, so Q4 of 2023 related to ransomware. So if you're familiar with Mandiant Intel reporting, malware families are always on all caps, and then our threat actors have a bunch of different kind of levels. So we've got uncategorized or UNC groups here. Think of that as a cluster of threat activity. And then we have a FIN group. So think of a FIN group, high-level attribution. We have a lot of information on them. We've typically seen them for quite a while, like 5, 7+ years, still active. So just a little bit of different levels of threat actor naming is what we have. So now I want to move to step 2 and understand how all of those threats operate. So I'm going to collect all of the MITRE ATT&CK mappings that we have ever had for every single one of those threats. I put them in a spreadsheet. I do deduplicate. So I take out the tactic, because you might have the same technique across multiple tactics. I just want that technique once. So I take the tactic out of this frequency analysis, and I have another spreadsheet that still has it all mapped. But basically, I want to say how many of my threat actors leverage each of these techniques. So what's the frequency of these techniques being used to my relevant threats? So we had 15 total ransomware threats on the previous slide. So a high priority technique, they basically cut it in thirds. So 15 to 11 of the identified threats leverage that technique. That's a high priority for me. Medium, 10 to 6, and low is 5 to 1. So again, concept, eat it like an elephant, one bite at a time. How can we bite this off in a way that we're focusing on the highest ROI for what we're looking at, right? So if you think of high priority techniques, those are the ones that are most likely to be seen against your organization. Those are the ones we want to test and remediate first. So this is what it would look like if I graph those frequency levels for the techniques I pulled for the ransomware threat actors. So you can see kind of like how much it's really reduced what we want to focus at if we just look at high priority. So I pulled like 270 some, I think, techniques total. There is no way that we can go through all of those. But I can probably do 11% in a quarter, right? So just a way to slice and dice the data. Another way to look at it is across the MITRE ATT&CK framework, looking at tactics. Unfortunately, the tactics aren't in like attack lifecycle order, but you kind of get the idea of maybe we want to focus on defense, invasion, and discovery because they have the most high priority techniques, and we can only run a certain number per month. Definitely different ways that you can slice and dice the data to make that decision of what best fits your team, your organization, and your workload. Heat maps. I love heat maps. I hate heat maps, so we're going to talk about them for a minute. A heat map is a one-dimensional view of your data set. So as I mentioned before, a technique has an infinite number of instantiations of a way a threat actor could leverage it. So if you ever see a heat map where somebody says, we have coverage for this technique, no, you don't. You might have some capabilities for that technique, but you are never going to be 100% covered. Just kind of keep that in mind when you're looking at heat maps. This heat map is just looking at the threats. So what I did is I highlighted high priority threats as red, medium is orange, low is yellow, just like in the previous graphics. What this helps, though, is identify for like a CISO level, right? They seem to like these a lot, is where do you need to focus your resources, right? How many of these should you be focusing on? I've had organizations come and say, I want to turn the whole MITRE ATT&CK heat map green for my detections. My response is why? Why would I focus on one of these that is not highlighted and put resources on that if my intel is saying it's not likely to impact my organization? Let's focus on the things that matter most first, and then we can iterate through, right? So that's what this is kind of displaying. In some engagements, I will do another heat map with the results of our findings. So I might come in and say, these were the threats that we looked at, and we found that maybe we have detection capabilities in one of these areas and I'll turn it green, or it's an optimized capability and I'll turn it blue. I'm not conveying there that we have complete coverage of that technique. I'm trying to tell the CISO, hey, you've got some capabilities here, but here's another high priority technique where you have maybe nothing. You don't even have telemetry. That helps them make a decision of where they want to focus resources based on the ROI for that decision, right? So different ways to communicate it. Very effective tool, just a lot of caveats about how to communicate that tool. So now that we have that and we have our MITRE ATT&CK techniques, we need to look at whatever validation tool, purple team assessment we want to leverage, and we want to basically map those techniques and the threat actors to the actions that that validation is going to test. So it looks a little bit clearer, I believe, on this next slide. So this is essentially everything we did up to this point. Step one, threats. Threats are connected to your technique. So in an Excel spreadsheet, I would have all my techniques in one column, and I'd have another column with the threat actor. So I might have 15 rows for T1027 because T1027 is used by all 15 of my threats. So I'll have it not deduped in that sense, but I want to know which threat actor uses which technique. And then I'll align that technique with another column, priority level. So 15 columns, T1027, each has a threat actor, each has a priority level. And then I'll start looking in the database for the actions that I can have the availability to run for a validation tool, for example. And I'll say, I want to test T1027 for FIN8. What actions do I have available for specifically how FIN8 uses that technique? I'll pull those and tell the validation team, go run those. That's part one. So if I have the ability, I'll do part two. So part one is threat actor specific to the threats that matter. But I know that T1027 is a very high priority threat, right? There's so many ways it could be used. If I'm testing it now, I may as well test some generic actions of how a lot of different threat actors use it, maybe not specific to any of the threats on my list, but while I'm testing it, let me test it. So I'll do like a threat actor specific, and then I'll do a generic round. Also depending on the technology and the environment that I have and the bandwidth of the engineers or the analysts that are running those actions. So I try to balance load that as well, looking at network and endpoint so that the engineers aren't overwhelmed. So you want to kind of understand how many actions they can review in a certain time period. What you don't want to do, and I've seen this a lot, is you have a validation tool. You just click a button to run an action. It doesn't take you any time. The tool does it for you. But what's missed is you need to now go and look at all of those actions, right, the contextualizing and review of it, because you can't always trust that the tool is configured correctly. You need to test it. So I've seen organizations go and run maybe 700 actions at once. They can't do anything with those, right? You ran too many. There's no way you can operationalize those results. So that's why we balance load it. So we're going to focus on the top two techniques, so T1027 and then T1082. And this is where the data gets not as real as it was in the previous step. So basically in this scenario, I've got 5 actions for each technique aligned to my threat actor that I'm going to run in the environment. Okay? So we go rerun those actions, we get results back. So in our spreadsheet of truth, this would be maybe logged, alerted, blocked from the tool or from the purple team. We'll then go and we'll review it and we'll get our results. And hopefully they match. Hopefully they're all the same and we can say, yep, this was run perfectly. We don't have to worry about any of the results being false positives or issues, right? Based on those results, we get our assessment. So now we can look and say, well, for the first one, right, for FIN8, T1027, it's an opportunity for improvement because we logged it and we blocked it, but we didn't alert on it. Do we want an alert to know that we blocked it, or are we good with it just staying blocked and we don't see anything related to it, right? So you go through these decision-making pieces, and Omar will dig into that. But essentially, this is how that concept works. So now we can start making our graphs from our validation run. So detection capability assessment, like we talked to before. These are the results that we got. We've got a good number of detection capabilities, right? CISO should be happy. But we do have some areas and gaps that we can start improving on. We can also look at it according to threat actors. We are good with LV and Basta ransomware, the malware families. But when we look at UNC 3944 and UNC 4393, not so good, right? We got some red there. So we might want to prioritize maybe the gaps in logging and visibility and the gaps in alerting there for remediation, where maybe the opportunities for improvement, they're not as critical. Maybe we put those on the back burner for now. We can also look at this based on the specific action or the technique that we're looking at. Is there a technique we want to focus on? Maybe if we just focus on the T1027 because there's more red there and more gaps, we can build a detection that captures all of that in one stroke and we can close that out. And then we'll focus on T1082. I think that's you now.
All right. I know this flowchart looks crazy. It's hard to visualize this stuff in one slide. This process takes sometimes hours, days, weeks, right? It all depends on what you're looking at. But mainly, we want to focus on the outside view, because just for the example here. So let's say you have identified a gap in alerting, right? You want to address that in order of priority. Do you have the logs that exist? Let's say in this example, we do have those logs because we are logging, right? Is then, we want to go ahead and look through that to see, is there a security tool that can build a detection for it? Or do we have the capability to build that detection? Sure, we do. So then we move on to our build the actual detection, test it, deploy it, run validation against it again. And then you come back to that box that we talked about before with that optimized capability or your gap in blocking. You're going to, at that moment, decide, all right, is this something that I care about just to alert for my teams? Or is this something I can block and just let go? Or is this something I block and I want to let my SOC analyst know, like, hey, this action was blocked on this machine. Something might be going on. You might want to go address that, right? And that's the type of stuff that we're looking for. That requires input from the respond function, your SOC analysts, your SOC managers, the detect function, and as well as validate, right? And so in our example here, we looked through for Fin 8 and on 4933 right here on phase 3. We saw that there were opportunities for improvement. We saw that there were some gaps in alerting, some gaps in logging and visibility. After we've gone through this flow chart through multiple sessions, we come out with another new report for our management. We've gone through and remediated the gaps. We've updated the chart to give back to your management to show, hey, for Fin 8 and 4393, we have successfully taken an opportunity for improvement and turned it into a detection, turned it into an optimized capability. We decided that, hey, we're cool. We're logging this stuff. We're blocking it. We do not want to alert on it. We're just going to let that go. And that, now you have actually moved the needle on it. And with UNC 4393, where you had a gap in logging and visibility, because you brought those logs in, now you actually turned that into a detection. And now you have, a new chart that you can take back to your leadership and say, all right, well, now we maybe need to focus on UNC 3944 and get some logging and visibility in there. All right.
And just one thing before we go into the key takeaways. Some of the things we've been getting requests from clients that have us like hands-on in their environment doing remediation is it's not always so linear as some of our charts may indicate, right? The flow doesn't always happen. We hit roadblocks. So sometimes if we need to bring on new logging or telemetry, the client might already be maxed out on the amount of logs that they can pull in. So we have to kind of put that as a, hey, we can actually remediate this because you have no more room for logs, and that becomes a business decision for the client. Or you can actually alert on this because you don't have the correct technology or controls in your environment to do that. Again, that's a business and risk decision for the client to make. But we're over on 2 minutes, so just want to wrap up here with the key takeaways. So the Intel-led piece is best practice, with Intel being your guiding light. So hopefully the Intel that kicks all of this off was pretty evident in that today. Aligning the validation efforts to your organization, so avoiding the shotgun approach, making sure you're testing what matters to your organization and also what aligns to the technology that you have deployed in your environment. So for example, if you're only in a Windows environment, maybe it doesn't make sense to test actions related to Mac OS, right? Operationalize those findings to improve. We don't like going to clients and finding the same things over and over again. We want to see it getting better. So we want to operationalize those and also align functions to teams to promote the collaboration. So as Omar's talked about with the detect and the SOC piece and the response piece and Intel and all of those pieces, they should all be working together in synergy and not just in silos. Are there any questions? Everybody's really hungry for lunch. All right.
Oh, question.
Are you able to send out the slide deck, or is this part of the Defender's Advantage?
So some pieces are, but...
Yeah, we'll send out, if you can shoot us an email. It's just been hard for us to respond if you message us in the app for it. I'll just put our emails back up here, sorry. All the slides are going by. There. Just shoot us an email and I'll get a PDF over to you. The Defender's Advantage, that is, you can just Google that and there's a PDF download of it. We are in the process of doing a version 2 that should hopefully be out Q4. Okay.
Cool.
What happened to your hair?
Wow. Security. Yeah. Well, also, it was during
Long
COVID when that picture was taken, so yeah.
I think there was a
it's gone.
jujitsu incident, right?